Hello, it's been a minute. A few months, actually, since I last made a video, so I wanted to say hi and reintroduce myself. My name is Brienne, and I am a costumer and sewist who enjoys coaxing fabric into fashion, and the occasional craft sometimes. I also wanted to say thank you for those who have shown continued support and interest in my sewing. It really means a lot, so thanks. I also want to wish you Chag, pesach, sameach. Passover is my favorite holiday. Well, after Halloween, of course. And not just because of the 4 customary glasses of wine, though it is a nice perk. The celebration's theme of liberation and freedom from oppression is something that I particularly cherish. Because while this story tells the tale of Jewish people being freed from slavery in Egypt, the message of the holiday to demand an end to human rights violations is applicable to this day. And it's a personal favorite Seder topic of mine for those who are attending to share how we intend to challenge the injustices that our world is facing today. And if you're not familiar with Passover, you may be asking, what's a Seder? In short, it's the celebratory meal and service of the holiday in which the Haggadah, the text of the Passover story along with some blessings, is read while family and friends gather round in comfort to eat classic dishes, such as matzah and maror, matzo ball soup, and coconut macaroons. Next to the Seder plate, the most iconic item on the Passover table is the matzah cover. During the proceedings, 3 pieces of matzah are placed into a 3-pocketed bag to be blessed and eaten later. While getting ready for this year's holiday, I became curious about the history of matzah covers. And while my admittedly brief search didn't produce much on the origin, I did find some beautiful examples of embroidered covers from as early as the late 19th century. Of note was that matzah covers were predominantly round until the mid-20th century. What we think of matzah today, thin, crispy pieces of unleavened bread, is actually a recent result of industrialization. Compared to the thousands of years Jewish people had been making round matzah. Isaac Singer, a Frenchman, and not the same Isaac Singer who invented the sewing machine, first automated the process with a matzah dough rolling machine in 1838, but it wasn't until 1888 that Lithuanian-born Dov Be'er opened a matzah-making factory in Cincinnati, Ohio, and his company Manischewitz started mass-producing the angular bread of affliction as we know it. If you want to learn more about the historical matzah making process, check out DSA Thread's recent video on the subject. Another thing I noted was that many of the museum-housed matzah covers mentioned being handmade by the family. In the spirit of that tradition, I decided to make my own matzah cover and basket, and with this tutorial, you can as well. So let's get to sewing. For the matzah basket, cut a piece of fabric that is 14.5 inches on all sides. You'll need 1 square for the interior and 1 for the exterior, and they can be of the same fabric or contrasting. You'll also need to cut out a 14-inch square of heavyweight interfacing. I only had a medium weight in my stash, so I cut 2 squares and ironed them onto the wrong sides of both the inner and outer fabrics. Once your interfacing situation is settled, place the basket pieces right sides together and pin or clip around the edges. Sew around the edges, lifting your presser foot with the needle down to rotate the fabric for neat corners. I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance and leave about a 4-inch opening in the center of one side to turn the fabric right side out. Clip corners before turning out. Once flipped right side out, I'd recommend using a creaser to push out the corners. You can also use a capped pen or a chopstick for the job. And then give it a good press. Remember that opening we left? Well, now it's time to pin it closed and sew along all 4 edges of the square. I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this top stitching and a thread that matches the outside of the basket. Next, lay your fabric with the outer fabric up and lightly mark 2.5 inches from the edge on all sides with a pencil or chalk. Cut out 4 strips of 30-inch long ribbon. Fold the ribbon in half to find the center point and line it up with the outer edge of the ribbon with your marked line, leaving an equal amount of ribbon hanging from either edge. Attach the ribbon that is parallel to the one you have just pinned down, and then sew both in place by stitching closely along the edge of either side of the ribbon. Repeat that process again with the perpendicular ribbons. Once all ribbons are attached, tie the closest ends together with the inside facing up, and mazel tov! You have a basket! If you're using ribbon that will likely fray, I'd recommend rolling and sewing the edges if it's made of a natural fiber. Or if it's a synthetic, like polyester satin in this case, you can carefully run the edge near, but not touching, a candle flame to bind the end. At this point, your basket will be fully functional, but feel free to untie the ribbons and add some decoration. Personally, I chose to hand stitch on some lace trim that I had in my stash and happens to coordinate quite well with my Seder plate. And speaking of Seder, this basket is now ready for the table to hold the extra matzah that doesn't go into the cover, which we'll make next. Start your matzah cover by cutting out an 11 by 11 inch square. This will be a guide for a cover specifically for modern matzah, but if you'd like to honor the more historically round shape, then you can still follow this guide, but cut your pieces in the round with a diameter of at least 15 inches. For this project, I chose to start with the decoration. From my browsing of 100-year-old matzah covers online, as well as memories of my grandparents' own embroidered cover, I decided to embellish the bag with the word matzah in Hebrew. After printing out the lettering, I copied the word onto tracing paper. To position the design, I folded both the paper and the fabric in half vertically and horizontally, and then matched up the lines. But I double-checked the spacing with a gauge just to be sure. To transfer the design onto the fabric itself, I stitched over the outlined letters with some thread that will match the embroidery thread I'll be using later. Since this is just a guide, the stitches don't have to be all that even, and I'd recommend using a medium length so it's easier to remove the paper, but not so loose as to not be helpful later. Once the outline is stitched, tear away the tracing paper. Use a tweezer to help remove the small or stuck bits. Don't worry about the mess it'll make. You can clean it up along with the chametz in preparation for Pesach. Next comes the actual embroidery, in which I'm using a satin stitch in some silvery satin thread to fill in the letters. This takes a good bit of time, but it can also be done on the couch, while watching your favorite costumers, or listening to some holiday tunes by the Macaroons to get into the Passover spirit. This would also be a good time to point out that while I chose to decorate my matzah cover with embroidery, you certainly don't have to. Get creative with it. Use fabric markers, appliques, ribbons, lace, or even keep it simple with just a cherished outer fabric. You're making this for your table after all, so feel free to make it your own. Since I had some leftover lace trim from the basket, I decided to add some to the cover to tie it all in. And speaking of lace and favorite costumers, I watched DSA Thread's latest video on matzah making while hand sewing the trim. Alright, the front of the matzah cover is decorated and it's time to move on to construction. But first, does this meme look vaguely like an AT-AT or is it just me? In addition to the top of the cover, you'll need to cut out a square for the back side as well as 4 same-size pieces for the interior. I'm using some lightweight linen out of my scraps box for the inside. For the 2 outer pieces of the cover, place one of the interior fabric squares right side to right side and pin only the top edge. Sew the pinned edge of both top and bottom pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then open up the pieces and iron the seam allowance towards the lining fabric. Stitch the pressed over seam allowance to the lining fabric close to the joined edge. This is also known as understitching. Once you've flipped the lining to the inside and have a finished top edge, baste the lining to the main fabric around the remaining 3 edges using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You should now have 2 squares of interior fabric remaining. These will form the dividers for your 3 pocketed matzah cover. Start by hemming the top edge of each square of fabric. Since I'm using linen, I pulled a thread with some tweezers and folded along the line it made, then folded again to encase the raw edges. Now that all the pieces are individually prepared, it's time to put them together. Lay the front and back pieces on top of each other, right side to right side. Then lay down the 2 interior pieces, making sure all 4 pieces are aligned at the top edge and securing them in place. Clip or pin around the remaining 3 edges. Sew around those 3 edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you have a serger, you can finish off the raw edges as such. Then turn the cover right side out from the top opening and use the tool of your choice to push out the corners. And there you have it! A matzah cover with 3 pockets for the Seder. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you enjoy making these Passover projects even more if you choose to do so. Most of all, I wish you a very happy holiday, and here's to celebrating liberation from enslavement and to continuing to challenge injustice and bigotry in all forms today. L'chaim. If you did like this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below about either your favorite thing about Passover, what actions you plan to take to further human rights in the present day, or both. Happy Passover to me.